They turned a symbol of black freedom into a whitewashed lie. The Statue of Liberty was meant to honor freed slaves until America changed her face. That's the truth they never wanted you to know. Because behind that copper crown and torch, there's a buried story, one about emancipation, revolution, and the rewriting of history. When you look up at Lady Liberty, what do you see? A tall white figure, draped in robes, holding a torch to the sky, the so-called mother of exiles, welcoming the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. But what if I told you that the first face ever imagined for her wasn't white at all? What if the earliest version of this so-called beacon of freedom had African features, full lips, tight curls, skin of bronze, and a shackle broken at her feet? Because that's what she was, a monument to the end of slavery. The original Statue of Liberty was black. In the 1860s, as France celebrated the fall of American slavery, French sculptor Frédéric-Auguste Bartholdi began designing a statue to honor freedom and emancipation. His first sketches were clear: a woman with African features, chains broken around her ankles, standing tall as a symbol of liberation. France, fresh off abolishing slavery in its own colonies, wanted to gift America a tribute to the newly freed people across the Atlantic. But when that idea reached U.S. ears, something changed. The American elite, the same society that had just fought a war over slavery, didn't want a towering black woman representing their freedom. They couldn't handle that truth. They wanted to forget, so the chains were erased. The African face was softened, and slowly the vision of liberty was bleached until she fit their comfort. By the time Lady Liberty stood in New York Harbor, her story had been rewritten from a monument to emancipation into a myth of European immigration. Ask yourself, why does a statue meant to symbolize freedom still have broken chains at her feet? Why are they barely mentioned in schoolbooks or tours? Because those chains tell the story that white America wanted to hide, that the Statue of Liberty was born from black struggle. It's right there, carved in copper, silent but undeniable. You see, liberty wasn't always about immigrants yearning to breathe free. That line came decades later. At first, liberty meant freedom from slavery. It meant the first black men and women who walked out of bondage, still wearing scars, but breathing air that no longer belonged to a master. It meant the promise of equality, a promise that, to this day, remains unfulfilled. And yet they covered her truth in patina, turned bronze to green, and told us she was never one of us. They rewrote the symbol so thoroughly that now, millions look up and see whiteness instead of freedom. But if you strip back the paint, if you look beneath the copper, the story is still there. The original design, the early models, the letters between Bartholdi and French abolitionists, all proof that Lady Liberty's roots are African. The same America that celebrated freedom tried to erase the very people it was supposed to honor. Think about that. They took a symbol of black power and made her their icon. They turned a monument to our liberation into a trophy for theirs. But no matter how much they hide it, truth shines brighter than torchlight. The real Statue of Liberty is not a symbol of whiteness. She is a reflection of us, of our ancestors, of every black soul who fought for a freedom that was never freely given. So next time you see her, don't just see the statue, see the struggle, see the chains, see the black woman they tried to erase. Because she's still there, standing tall above their lies, holding a light that was always ours. Before the Statue of Liberty ever stood in New York Harbor, before her torch became a postcard, her story began in the heart of France, in a world still wrestling with its own colonial guilt. France had abolished slavery only 2 decades before, in 1848, and across Europe, abolitionists were celebrating freedom, progress, and the end of human bondage. The air was full of ideas about liberty and justice, but also the question, what does freedom really look like? For the sculptor Frédéric-Auguste Bartholdi, that question became an obsession. He envisioned a colossal woman, not a goddess, but a human symbol, breaking free from chains, rising out of oppression into light. She would be a gift from France to the United States, a nation that had just ended slavery after centuries of brutality. His inspiration didn't come from European nobility or Greek mythology. It came from the struggle of black people. His sketches from the 1860s show it clearly: a tall black woman, her feet wrapped in shattered shackles, the expression on her face, both powerful and mournful. Her crown wasn't yet a spiked halo, but a simple head wrap, like those worn by African women in the French colonies and in the American South. Bartholdi wasn't alone in that vision. Many French abolitionists saw the U.S. Civil War as a moral turning point for the West, proof that liberty could triumph over slavery. They wanted the monument to celebrate the freedom of the enslaved, not the dominance of the colonizers. But when the concept crossed the ocean, something happened. America wasn't ready to face its reflection. Politicians smiled politely at France's idea, but in closed rooms they panicked. The country was barely 12 years past the Civil War, and Reconstruction was hanging by a thread. Black men were being lynched in the South, black women were being silenced, and the North was already tired of fighting for equality. The last thing America wanted was a statue reminding the world that freedom was born out of black suffering. So they told Bartholdi to change her, to adjust the image. Her face became more European. The head wrap was replaced by a crown of rays, like Roman goddesses. The chains at her ankles, hidden under her robe, where no one would notice unless they looked closely. Her story was whitewashed before she was even built. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about power. The ruling class of America needed a new myth, one that erased the face of the freed slave and replaced it with the face of European liberty. So they recast her not as a symbol of emancipation, but as a beacon for immigrants, a convenient narrative for a growing industrial empire that needed cheap labor and moral cover. And just like that, the truth of Lady Liberty's origins was buried beneath politics and copper. But history leaves fingerprints, and if you follow them back, they lead straight to Africa, to the spirit of liberation that the world tried to forget. Because no matter how they changed her form, the foundation of liberty itself was born from the fight of a people who refused to be broken. And deep down, that's what the statue still represents, even if the world refuses to admit it. The irony is almost poetic. The very country that turned her white is the same one that taught her what freedom costs. Every inch of that statue, every torch, every tablet, every hidden chain, carries the story of a freedom America didn't earn, but was forced to accept. Ask yourself, how can a nation claim liberty when it's afraid to show who first inspired it? The answer lies not in marble or copper, but in truth, the kind they couldn't wash away. Before Lady Liberty became a national icon, she was an entirely different woman. In her earliest sketches, Bartholdi didn't sculpt a faceless symbol, he sculpted a soul. The first drawings from his Paris studio showed a dark-skinned woman, unmistakably African in heritage, holding a broken chain instead of a tablet, her torch low, not raised. She wasn't welcoming the world's tired masses, she was rising from her own chains. Her features were strong, regal, and familiar to anyone who knew the faces of African women who had survived the ships and the sugar fields. This wasn't an accident. Bartholdi had traveled through Egypt years before, where he had been mesmerized by the colossal statues of Nubian queens and pharaohs, the monuments that rose from African soil like eternal witnesses to human achievement. He studied their faces, their poise, their power. So when he imagined liberty, he drew from Africa's past, not Europe's myths. In early drafts, she looked less like a Roman goddess and more like a queen of Kush or Kemet. Her head crowned with light, but her face full of struggle. Her eyes weren't serene, they were unflinching. You could see the weight of centuries in her gaze, the same look in the faces of black women who carried both nations and families through oppression. But that image was too real for America. When U.S. financiers and politicians saw the early models, they rejected her outright. They wanted liberty, but not that liberty. They wanted an ideal that wouldn't remind them of chains. They asked for her to be refined, to represent the Western spirit. Those words were code for one thing: whiten her. Her lips were thinned, her nose straightened, her skin tone faded into pale copper. And just like that, the first black goddess of freedom was reborn as a white idol of illusion. The irony cuts deep. The statue meant to celebrate emancipation was redesigned to erase the emancipated. And in that transformation lies the truest mirror of America's conscience. Even in victory, the nation could not bear to see the face of its own deliverance reflected in the image of a black woman. But despite their erasure, fragments of the original survive: sketches in French archives, photographs of early plaster models, and written correspondence from Bartholdi himself, confirming that his first concept depicted an African woman breaking her chains at the feet. In one letter, he wrote of liberty as the light born from darkness, her chains falling away. There it is, in his own hand, the truth carved in ink, long before copper. Yet America turned her back on it. They chose denial over honesty, mythology over reality. Still, the chains remained, hidden beneath her robe, where only those who sought truth could find them. And maybe that's poetic justice, because even when they tried to bury her, the truth found a way to survive, wrapped in metal, standing in plain sight. It's almost as if Bartholdi himself knew what would happen. Maybe he left those chains there for us, a secret message to future generations that liberty's roots were forged in the fire of African struggle. So the next time you stand beneath her shadow, don't just look up, look down, look at her feet, see what they wanted you to ignore. There lies the proof of everything they denied. Liberty wasn't born in whiteness, she was born in chains, and those chains were ours. When the Statue of Liberty's idea finally reached American shores, it didn't arrive as a celebration. It arrived as a problem. The year was 1871. The Civil War was over, but the war for equality was just beginning. Reconstruction was in full swing. Black senators were sitting in Congress, and former slaves were building schools and towns of their own. But in the same breath, the Ku Klux Klan was rising. Lynch mobs were terrorizing the South, and white America was struggling to accept what it had created, a new nation with free black citizens. Into that chaos came Bartholdi's vision, a monument to liberty, born from emancipation. When he presented his idea to American officials, they smiled politely, nodding at the poetry of it all. But behind closed doors, they saw something dangerous, a statue that didn't just symbolize freedom, but who it was for. In the United States, liberty was a word that had always belonged to white men. They didn't want to share it, and they certainly didn't want it represented by a black woman. So quietly, they began to rewrite the statue's purpose. The concept of emancipation was scrubbed from the American marketing campaign. Newspaper articles stopped mentioning the abolitionist message. The sketches of the dark-skinned woman with broken chains were replaced by images of a pale Roman figure, draped in neoclassical robes. When Bartholdi visited America in 1871, he was told to redesign her to appeal to the American public. Translation: make her white, make her safe, make her forget. It was a political makeover, not of copper and clay, but of conscience. By the time the U.S. fundraising campaigns began, liberty had already been rewritten. Instead of honoring the end of slavery, she was now pitched as a monument to shared democratic ideals between France and America, a sanitized story that erased the blood, sweat, and tears of the people who had earned freedom with their own hands. The final blow came when the U.S. government refused to fund the statue's pedestal. Think about that. They didn't even want to pay for the foundation of a monument built to honor liberty. It was the people, not the politicians, who eventually raised the money, but by then, the narrative had been cemented. Bartholdi's African liberty had become America's whitewashed myth. When she was finally unveiled in 1886, the world saw a towering woman of European features holding her torch to the sky. What they didn't see, what they were never told, were the broken shackles hidden beneath her robe. Even today, tour guides gloss over them, treating them as decorative or symbolic. But those chains are the only surviving evidence of her true story. They are the last whisper of the truth Bartholdi tried to protect, the truth that freedom in America was paid for in black blood. They called her the Statue of Liberty, but what they really built was a monument to America's denial. And yet, that denial tells us something powerful, because every lie leaves a shadow, and in the shadow of that statue still stands the people it was meant to honor. The light she holds doesn't belong to the myth, it belongs to us. Every flicker of that flame is a reminder that no matter how much they rewrite the story, the roots of liberty remain African. So when they tell you she represents freedom, tell them this. Freedom didn't begin in New York Harbor. It began in the fields, in the resistance, in the prayers of a people who refused to die in chains. That's the liberty they tried to hide. That's the liberty they couldn't erase. At the feet of the Statue of Liberty, there's a detail most visitors never notice. Two broken chains, one still wrapped around her left foot, the other shattered across the pedestal. They're not decorative, they're not random. They are the original heart of the monument, the only surviving trace of its true identity, a symbol of emancipation. When Bartholdi first designed the statue, those chains weren't tucked away in the shadows. They were front and center, held proudly in her raised hand, as a declaration of freedom from bondage. It was meant to say, the age of slavery is over. But by the time America accepted the gift, that message had become too uncomfortable, too real. So the broken chains were moved out of sight, buried beneath the folds of her robe, literally hidden under Liberty's dress. And from that moment on, the story changed. Textbooks, museum plaques, even official National Park Service guides began describing her torch as the light of enlightenment, her crown as the rays of freedom, and her tablet as the law. But the chains, they became invisible, both in the statue's design and in the nation's conscience. Yet they remain, copper reminders that truth doesn't disappear just because someone tries to bury it. For anyone who looks closely, the symbolism is undeniable. The chains aren't broken because of an abstract idea of liberty. They're broken because of human struggle, because of people who fought to end their own oppression. They're the physical memory of those who refused to be property, who prayed and bled and died for the right to stand free. And that's exactly what made the US government uncomfortable. A white liberty holding a book is patriotic. A black liberty breaking chains is revolutionary. The former flatters America's ego, the latter confronts its hypocrisy. So they pushed the chains out of view and taught generations to look up at her torch instead of down at her feet. But the ground tells a truer story. Beneath that robe lies the spirit of every enslaved man and woman, whose freedom was never honored in bronze. The irony is poetic. The world's most famous symbol of liberty still stands on the remnants of bondage. And yet, that irony also redeems her, because despite the lies layered over her face, the statue's foundation, both literally and metaphorically, remains rooted in the black struggle for freedom. Every photograph of liberty is an accidental confession of that truth. Every sunrise that hits her torch also illuminates those chains, and the longer you stare, the harder it is to unsee. It's as if Bartholdi left us a secret message, carved not in words but in copper and silence. They can hide her meaning, but they can't erase it. That hidden symbolism speaks louder now than ever before. It reminds us that America's greatest monuments are not defined by what they celebrate, but by what they conceal. And beneath Lady Liberty's polished exterior lies a truth that refuses to stay buried. A truth born in Africa, shackled in America, and immortalized in a statue the world calls free. Because liberty without memory isn't liberty at all, it's just decoration. And somewhere deep down, the statue herself seems to know that. The way her foot steps forward, pressing down on the broken chains, feels less like a pose and more like a promise that the real meaning of freedom can't be hidden forever. When the idea of the Statue of Liberty first took shape, it wasn't an American dream, it was a French statement. In the 1860s, France was a nation wrestling with its own moral contradictions, a republic that preached liberty while still benefiting from colonial exploitation. But many French abolitionists, artists, and intellectuals were deeply inspired by the end of slavery in the United States, viewing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation as a turning point, not just for America, but for humanity itself. Édouard René de la Boulaye, a lawyer, author, and outspoken abolitionist, was one of those voices. He's the man who first proposed building a monument to commemorate the abolition of slavery and the triumph of freedom. To him, it wasn't about celebrating America's independence from Britain. It was about celebrating the end of human bondage. The statue was to be a gift from France to the freed people of America, a token of solidarity from one republic to another. Laboulaye envisioned a figure of liberty, not as a Greek goddess, but as a modern moral woman breaking free from chains. That was the symbolism that drove his friend, sculptor Frédéric-Auguste Bartholdi, to design what would become Lady Liberty. Her torch was meant to represent enlightenment after centuries of darkness, and that darkness was slavery. The chains at her feet were to be her defining feature. Even her posture, stepping forward with a determined stride, reflected movement out of oppression. This was France's message to the world: freedom is not inherited, it's fought for. But that message carried another layer, one that made American leaders uneasy. France was subtly calling out America's hypocrisy, a nation that had declared, "All men are created equal," while enslaving millions. The statue, in its original concept, was not a celebration of American greatness, but a challenge to live up to its own ideals. It was France's way of saying, "We see your progress, but we also see your sin." That quiet critique was embedded in the copper folds of the statue's robe, and it's why early drafts showed a distinctly African face, the face of freedom itself. Bartholdi and Laboulaye knew that true liberty had to be inclusive, that emancipation was not just a political act, but a moral awakening. Yet when the project finally approached reality, America's wealthy elite hijacked it. They reframed the statue's purpose, rebranded its symbolism, and rewrote its story to make it palatable to white audiences. The very people who resisted racial equality now championed liberty as their own icon. France's revolutionary message was stripped down, sanitized, and sold back to the public as a feel-good myth. Still, Bartholdi left traces, artistic fingerprints of defiance: the broken chains, the forward step, the slightly darker tone of the original copper. They're all remnants of his true vision, whispers of France's original message that America tried to erase. Even in his letters, Bartholdi lamented how politics had watered down his work. "The symbol must speak to the soul," he wrote, "but men will always try to bend truth to their comfort." That statement alone reveals everything. The statue wasn't designed to comfort America, but to confront it. France handed the US a mirror, and America painted over the reflection. The irony deepens when you realize that the statue's conception coincided with the rise of Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and systemic racial terror. The very nation that accepted a monument celebrating emancipation was simultaneously constructing new chains, not of iron, but of law, policy, and fear. Yet the French abolitionist's message remained encoded in the copper: that light must always follow darkness, that freedom born from black struggle cannot be erased by white narrative. The statue's torch, once meant to illuminate truth, became a symbol of selective memory, but its flame still burns for those who know where to look. So while textbooks frame the statue as a gift of friendship, the deeper truth is far bolder. It was a message of accountability. France wasn't congratulating America. It was reminding it of a promise that liberty without justice is hollow, that freedom without equality is fraud. And that message, carved in metal and shadow, still stands tall today. Every time liberty's torch lights the sky, it doesn't just celebrate freedom, it silently asks, whose freedom? When the Statue of Liberty's design crossed the Atlantic, something subtle and sinister began to change. The earliest sketches from Bartholdi's studio in France showed a strong woman with unmistakably African features, full lips, broad nose, deep expression. She wasn't modeled after a Greek goddess. She was modeled after freedom itself, a universal symbol shaped by the reality of slavery's end. But when the design reached American financiers and government officials, they balked. A black liberty? That was unthinkable to the men who still saw whiteness as synonymous with civilization. So they rewrote her face. They literally resculpted history. Bartholdi was pressured to soften the features, to narrow the nose, to lighten the expression, to make her European. The project's sponsors, largely from the American upper class, demanded an image that fit their version of liberty, one that looked familiar, one that could adorn newspapers and public celebrations without stirring racial debate. The African queen, who once stood at the heart of Bartholdi's sketches, was whitewashed into myth. This transformation didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, hidden behind the rhetoric of artistic refinement. Each revision stripped away another layer of truth. The chains at her ankles were moved from the front to behind her robe, out of sight from the public eye. The African contours of her face were smoothed, her gaze made less fierce, her skin imagined as marble white, not the bronze tones Bartholdi initially envisioned. In the final model, liberty looked more like the classical muses of Europe than the freed women of America. It was as if freedom itself had been colonized, repackaged to fit the sensibilities of a nation still unwilling to face its racial past. The statue that was meant to honor black emancipation was now being remade to comfort white guilt. And yet, for those who knew the story, those who remembered the original design, the truth was impossible to unsee. Black abolitionists in America whispered about the statue's hidden meaning, about the chains deliberately placed at her feet. To them, she still stood for something more profound than the sanitized version on postcards. They saw in her the faces of their ancestors, the women and men who fought, bled, and survived to make freedom real. They recognized that even if her color had been changed, her roots could not be. Every rivet, every fold of copper, still carried the spirit of emancipation that birthed her. The whitewashing of liberty's face is symbolic of a larger American pattern, how the nation has often rewritten history to erase the black fingerprints on its greatest achievements. From science to architecture, from the Constitution's hidden contradictions to the imagery on its currency, black influence has been systematically bleached out of the national narrative. The Statue of Liberty is simply the grandest example, a monument that was supposed to honor black freedom, transformed into a universal symbol of white liberty. It's a powerful reminder of how even monuments can lie. What makes this story even more chilling is how successful the rewrite was. Generations grew up believing the statue had nothing to do with slavery, that it was purely a celebration of American independence. Schoolbooks showed her glowing white against the sky, erasing both her African inspiration and her abolitionist message. Hollywood reinforced the illusion, turning her into a backdrop for patriotic films, disaster scenes, romantic moments, everything but truth. The black roots of Lady Liberty were quietly buried under layers of copper and propaganda. But time, as always, has a way of peeling back the disguise. When historians in the late 20th century began uncovering letters between Laboulaye and Bartholdi, the original intent became clear. Their discussions weren't about independence, they were about emancipation. They spoke passionately about the rebirth of liberty following the abolition of slavery. One sketch from Bartholdi's early notebooks even labels the figure Egyptian woman, suggesting that his inspiration came from African rather than European sources, likely from his travels in North Africa and his fascination with Nubian women, he described as majestic, dignified, and free. These are not coincidences, they are fingerprints of truth left behind by a sculptor whose art was censored by politics. So when we look at the Statue of Liberty today, we are not just seeing a monument, we are seeing a palimpsest, a layered story of what was erased, and what still whispers beneath. Beneath her polished surface is the ghost of a black woman, a woman whose face once promised that liberty belonged to everyone. And though America painted her white, the soul beneath that copper skin remains dark, radiant, and unbroken. Look closely at the Statue of Liberty, not at her torch or her crown, but at her feet. There, half buried beneath the folds of her robe, lie the broken shackles that almost no one talks about. They aren't decorative, they aren't symbolic in the vague patriotic sense the tour guides suggest. They are the last surviving trace of the statue's original purpose, a monument to the end of slavery, not the birth of America. When Bartholdi first sculpted liberty, those chains were front and center, openly displayed in her hands and around her feet. They were meant to tell the world that freedom was won through struggle, that the statue was not a goddess of conquest, but of emancipation. But as the American financiers took over, the chains became a problem. A reminder of bondage was too raw, too confrontational for a country that still hadn't reconciled with its own sins. So the chains were moved, pushed down to her ankles, tucked behind her robe, where tourists would never notice. What was once a declaration of freedom became a whisper. That single act, hiding the chains, was a metaphor for America's relationship with its racial history. The nation wanted the glory of liberty without the guilt of slavery. It wanted to celebrate freedom while silencing the story of those who paid the highest price for it. The final version of the statue was crafted to be safe, universal, and palatable, a blank canvas onto which anyone could project their idea of liberty. But in doing so, it stripped away the very identity that made it revolutionary. Bartholdi's original sketches didn't show a universal icon. They showed a woman of color rising from bondage. By burying those chains, America buried the truth of who liberty was meant to represent. For nearly a century after the statue was erected, the chains remained invisible to the public eye, both literally and historically. They weren't mentioned in school textbooks, tourist pamphlets, or patriotic speeches. Even when visitors climbed to the pedestal, the guide said nothing about the broken shackles beneath her. It wasn't until historians began examining Bartholdi's early models that the truth resurfaced. Lady Liberty was designed as a celebration of the abolition of slavery in the United States and France. Her chains weren't accidental, they were the foundation. The decision to hide them reflected the uncomfortable timing of her construction. The Statue of Liberty was completed in the 1880s, barely 2 decades after the Civil War and the official end of slavery. Reconstruction had failed, Jim Crow laws were tightening their grip, and racial terror was spreading across the South. The same country that was lynching freedmen was about to unveil a monument to liberty. How could it celebrate freedom while millions of its citizens still lived in fear? The solution was simple: rewrite the meaning. By recasting liberty as a symbol of immigration rather than emancipation, America could distance itself from its own hypocrisy. It could point to the statue as proof of its greatness, while hiding the chains that betrayed the truth. But symbols have power beyond what politicians intend. Even hidden, those chains still spoke. They spoke to the descendants of enslaved people who visited the statue and saw in her copper folds the story of their ancestors. They spoke to the historians who refused to accept the sanitized version of the past. And today, when high-resolution photos and digital scans reveal the shackles in full detail, they speak again, louder than ever. The hidden chains remind us that liberty in America has always been contested, always incomplete, always shadowed by the struggle of those it excluded. It's almost poetic that the chains remain there, half exposed, half hidden, just like the truth itself. Because no matter how many times history tries to cover it, the evidence refuses to disappear. The broken links around liberty's feet are physical proof that freedom in America was not handed down from above, it was fought for from below. They represent the resilience of a people who turned pain into progress, who transformed bondage into brilliance. Imagine if schoolchildren learned that version of the story, if every tourist who looked up at the statue knew she once held her chains proudly, unashamed. Imagine if we taught that liberty was born from black struggle, not abstract ideals. It would change how we see everything: the flag, the nation, even ourselves. Because the story of the Statue of Liberty isn't just about America's ideals, it's about America's denial. And the chains at her feet are the last honest thing left in a monument built on silence. So the next time you see her torch shining across New York Harbor, remember what's hidden at her feet. The real symbol of freedom isn't the light she holds high, it's the chains she broke. When most people picture the Statue of Liberty, they see her as purely European, a classical figure modeled after Greek goddesses and Roman virtues. But that's not where her story begins. Long before France ever offered a gift to America, Bartholdi had been fascinated by Africa, specifically Egypt. He traveled the Nile, studied its monuments, and fell in love with the grandeur of its civilization. He saw in the Nubian and Egyptian women a timeless strength, a dignity carved by centuries of sun and empire. In his notes and early sketches, he imagined a colossal woman at the mouth of the Suez Canal, a robed African figure holding a torch to guide travelers, symbolizing Egypt's light leading the East into a new age. He called her Egypt carrying the light to Asia. That was the prototype for the Statue of Liberty. She was meant to be African from the very beginning. When that project fell through, Bartholdi didn't abandon the concept, he repurposed it. He took the same inspiration, the same visual DNA, and transplanted it to America. The woman of Africa became the woman of liberty. Her robes remained, her torch stayed, her regal posture endured. What changed was her skin. The dark, copper-skinned woman, who was to represent Africa's brilliance, was lightened, whitened, and renamed to fit a new audience. It was a transformation that mirrored the world's rewriting of history itself. Africa's ideas, stolen and repackaged under European names. And yet, traces of her African origin remain, if you know where to look. The proportions of her face, the fullness of her features, the stylized curls beneath her crown, all echo Egyptian sculpture. Bartholdi's notebooks and letters reveal his admiration for the grandeur and calm beauty of Egyptian women, his fascination with the way they carried power without words. It's no coincidence that Liberty carries herself with that same silent authority, upright, unbent, unbothered by the weight of the world. That's not Greek grace, that's African majesty. But the world wasn't ready to see Africa as the mother of light. By the 19th century, colonial powers had spent decades painting Africa as backward, primitive, and uncivilized. To admit that one of the world's greatest symbols of freedom was inspired by African women would shatter that illusion. So the connection was buried, just like the chains. Historians scrubbed Bartholdi's Egyptian sketches from the mainstream narrative. Art historians labeled the design neoclassical, and textbooks quietly redrew the statue's origins as purely Western. The African roots of liberty were left to fade in dusty archives. Still, the truth has a way of surviving. Modern scholars and independent researchers have traced the statue's design back to Bartholdi's Egyptian concept sketches, confirming that the Statue of Liberty evolved directly from his vision of an African torchbearer. Even his choice of material, copper, carries echoes of the bronze and gold tones he associated with the African sun. In fact, when the statue was first unveiled in 1886, its copper surface gleamed reddish-brown before time turned it green. For years, Liberty was literally the color of African earth. Imagine that, the original face of freedom shining in brown and bronze, before oxidation and history washed her pale. It's poetic justice, in a way. Every photograph, every green postcard hides the truth beneath the surface. Liberty is still copper. She still carries the warmth of Africa in her bones, no matter how many centuries pass. The very metal she's made of refuses to let her forget where she came from. But what does it mean for America that the mother of its freedom icon was African? It means that liberty, the concept the nation worships, was born not in Europe, but in the cradle of black civilization. It means that the very image America holds up as the beacon of Western democracy was molded by African inspiration. And that's the irony they never wanted you to see. The face of the Western world's freedom is African, but she's been made to forget it. Look again at that statue. Imagine her standing, not on Liberty Island, but at the Suez Canal, bathed in desert light. Imagine her skin glowing copper red beneath the Egyptian sun. That was the vision Bartholdi saw, a woman of Africa holding the light of the world. And though America claimed her and renamed her, that African light never went out. It still burns in the torch she carries, no matter how much they tried to deny it. When France first proposed gifting the Statue of Liberty to the United States, it was meant as a celebration of freedom and the abolition of slavery, not as an immigration symbol, not as an emblem of general liberty, but as a tribute to the end of black bondage. That truth was clear in the early documents, in the meetings between French abolitionists and Bartholdi, and in the symbolism of the statue itself. But by the time Liberty's face was finalized, her meaning had been completely rewritten. America had changed her face, literally and figuratively, to fit a narrative it could live with. To understand that transformation, we have to step into the social climate of the late 1800s. Reconstruction had collapsed. The brief promise of equality after the Civil War was smothered under Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and racial terror. The same nation that had freed black people was now violently reminding them of their place. So when word spread that France wanted to send a statue celebrating the emancipation of enslaved Africans, many white Americans balked. They didn't want a monument that reminded them of a war they wanted to forget, or of the people they were still oppressing. The original idea for the statue, Liberty Enlightening the World, carried with it abolitionist fire. In its earliest versions, Liberty wasn't wearing a crown of European spikes. She wore a Phrygian cap, the ancient symbol of freed slaves. She wasn't meant to stand above immigrants. She was meant to stand with the formerly enslaved. Her message was clear. Freedom is not inherited. It is earned through struggle. But as American donors got involved, that message became too political, too black, too real. So the statue was redesigned to be softer, whiter, and more classical. Out went the African features. Out went the cap of freedom. In came the Greco-Roman crown, the safe version of liberty, detached from race and history. What emerged was a sanitized icon, a woman with European features holding a universal torch, stripped of her origin story. The shift wasn't just aesthetic, it was ideological. America wanted a liberty it could celebrate without confronting its hypocrisy. It wanted the light without the chains, the symbol without the story. By whitening liberty's image, the nation could claim freedom as its birthright, while ignoring the fact that millions were still living in shadow. But even as America tried to erase the statue's original purpose, clues of her true identity remained in plain sight. The broken shackles, the copper skin, the torch of enlightenment, these were all echoes of a deeper message that refused to be silenced. Every immigrant who saw the statue in the harbor was told she represented welcome. But to those who knew the truth, she also represented irony. Because while liberty stood tall proclaiming freedom to the world, black Americans were being jailed, beaten, and hung in the same land she watched over. The rebranding of liberty was more than propaganda. It was cultural surgery. The U.S. took an abolitionist symbol and recoded it into something that supported its myth of progress. Newspapers called her the mother of exiles. Poets romanticized her as the beacon for the tired and poor, and the government used her image to sell patriotism. But underneath the poetry and the postcards lay the silence of those whose freedom she was meant to honor. And yet, no amount of rebranding can erase the truth that was cast into her copper. The Statue of Liberty was not born from Europe's ideals. She was born from Africa's fire. She was not designed to welcome the oppressed of the world. She was designed to honor those already oppressed who had risen. America just changed the frame so it wouldn't have to face the reflection. So when we look at liberty today, we're not just seeing a statue, we're seeing a rewritten story. One that America turned into a symbol of itself. But symbols, like people, have memories. Beneath her whitewashed mythology, liberty remembers who she was. She remembers Egypt. She remembers the broken chains. She remembers the copper glow of African skin. And that memory, however buried, still glows beneath the green patina, waiting for the day the world sees her true face again. For more than a century, schoolchildren have stared up at the Statue of Liberty as the ultimate symbol of American freedom. They've colored her torch in art class, recited Emma Lazarus's poem about the huddled masses, and memorized her as the guardian of democracy. But ask them what she originally represented, and you'll get blank stares. Not because the truth was lost, but because it was buried. Buried by a system that understood the power of symbols and feared what would happen if people realized liberty itself had an African origin. The rewriting began early. When the statue was unveiled in 1886, the speeches made no mention of emancipation or the end of slavery. President Grover Cleveland praised liberty as the crowning glory of the republic, not the triumph of the freed. Newspapers echoed that sentiment, celebrating the statue as a beacon to immigrants, but avoiding the uncomfortable reality that it had been inspired by the freedom of enslaved people. The African roots of the design, the abolitionist intentions of its creators, all quietly erased. By the time the first history books were written about the monument, the original narrative had vanished entirely. This silence was no accident. America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was actively constructing its national myth, a story of unity, progress, and moral destiny. There was no room in that story for a reminder that the country's most iconic monument was meant to honor the people it had brutalized. So the textbooks were scrubbed clean. Teachers were told to focus on immigration, industry, and the melting pot. The statue became a metaphor for opportunity, not for liberation. It was easier that way. Easier to teach children a flattering lie than to confront an inconvenient truth. But the silence wasn't total. In the Black community, whispers of the statue's true meaning persisted. Writers, preachers, and activists passed down the oral story that Lady Liberty had once been a Black woman, a tribute to the end of slavery before she was whitewashed. Some even saw her torch as a symbol of the light Black people brought to the world through resilience and creation. Yet these perspectives rarely made it into the mainstream. For decades, the narrative of liberty as a white, European-looking goddess stood unchallenged in classrooms and museums. The result was devastating. Generations grew up believing that liberty was something America invented, not something its Black citizens had fought for. The statue, once a symbol of their ancestors' victory, became instead a monument they were told had nothing to do with them. It's hard to imagine how that felt, to look up at a statue meant to honor your freedom and realize history had erased your name from it. Even when evidence began surfacing, the sketches, the correspondence, the early models showing African features, institutions downplayed it. Museums called it artistic experimentation. Scholars avoided linking the design to abolitionist history for fear of politicizing the statue. But what could be more political than rewriting freedom itself? The silence of the textbooks wasn't just about omission, it was about ownership. America wanted to claim liberty as its invention, its export, its crown jewel. To admit that its greatest symbol of freedom was inspired by Africa would unravel that illusion. It would mean acknowledging that the torch lighting the world was first lit by people they tried to enslave. And that's the quiet irony every visitor unknowingly participates in when they pose for photos at Liberty Island. They smile beneath her torch, proud of what she represents, not realizing they're standing in the shadow of a story they were never meant to hear. But history has a heartbeat, and it never stops echoing. The silence can only last so long before the truth starts to rise. And when it does, it forces us to ask a question America has avoided for too long. What does liberty really mean if the people who built it were erased from its story? By the late 20th century, cracks began to appear in the perfect myth America had built around the Statue of Liberty. Historians, artists, and everyday truth seekers started digging, not for treasure, but for the truth that had been hidden beneath a century of white paint and patriotic storytelling. And what they found changed everything. Documents surfaced that traced the statue's original intent back to the abolitionist movements in both France and the United States. Letters between Édouard de Laboulaye, the French political thinker who conceived the idea, and sculptor Frédéric-Auguste Bartholdi, revealed that the monument was first envisioned not as a gift to European immigrants, but as a celebration of the end of slavery. The earliest sketches showed Liberty with distinctly African features, fuller lips, a wider nose, and a broken shackle in her hand instead of a tablet. In one draft, her foot even rested on the chains of bondage, symbolizing freedom from oppression. But somewhere between concept and completion, that vision was transformed. Researchers began piecing together the timeline of that transformation. When Bartholdi's idea first circulated in the 1860s, France had recently abolished slavery in its colonies, and the United States had just ended the Civil War. Liberty's image, as a freed black woman, fit perfectly with the global mood of emancipation. But as America drifted into Reconstruction and racial tensions deepened, white politicians and donors balked at the idea of a monument honoring the very people society was trying to suppress. So the project changed shape, literally. The African face was softened into European features. The shackles became smaller and less visible. The message of emancipation faded into one of universal freedom, a phrase vague enough to avoid controversy. Then in the 1980s, researchers from Howard University and other historically black institutions revisited the original French archives. What they uncovered reignited the debate. They found written evidence that Laboulie specifically referenced the abolition of slavery in America as the inspiration for the statue. The chains at her feet, still visible today to those who look closely, were meant to commemorate that event. But when the statue was presented to America in 1886, that context had been buried under layers of denial and political reframing. The truth had been standing there the whole time, hiding in plain sight. As this information spread, it electrified black scholars and communities. The notion that Lady Liberty had African roots resonated deeply, not just as a historical correction, but as a reclamation of a symbol that had been stolen. Writers like Dr. Leroy F. Bennett and researchers like William Cohen began publishing findings that connected Liberty's imagery to African liberation, to the freedom of the enslaved, and to the global struggle against colonialism. What had once been dismissed as fringe theory suddenly had academic weight, and while mainstream historians tried to downplay these revelations, artists and activists amplified them. Murals began appearing in Harlem, Oakland, and Atlanta depicting the Statue of Liberty with dark skin, holding her torch high as a symbol of black resilience. Poets reclaimed her words, musicians sang of her origins, and teachers began to weave her true history into lessons once stripped of context. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about unearthing the truth that had been buried beneath centuries of fear. By the 2000s, even major media outlets began covering the controversy. Debates flared about whether the statue's African features were ever intentional or just a coincidence of early drafts. But regardless of the academic tug-of-war, one fact remained. The statue's origins were deeply entangled with the story of slavery, abolition, and freedom. Ignoring that truth didn't make it less real. It only showed how much America still struggled to face its own reflection. For millions of people of African descent, the awakening was more than academic. It was emotional. To learn that one of the world's most recognizable symbols of freedom might have been inspired by their ancestors' liberation was both healing and enraging. Healing, because it restored pride to a narrative of erasure. Enraging, because it proved how systematically that pride had been taken away. And as the story spread online, new generations began asking questions their parents never thought to ask. Why does Liberty's torch look like it's been borrowed? Why are there chains on her feet? Why does the official story avoid mentioning slavery at all? Every question peeled back another layer of deception, revealing the uncomfortable truth that freedom in America has always been selective, celebrated in statues, but denied in practice. The awakening was not just about one monument. It was about ownership of the truth, and what happens when that truth can no longer be contained. For once, the statue stopped being silent stone and started speaking again, not through her torch, but through the millions of voices now retelling her real story. When the Statue of Liberty was first conceived, she was not the pale symbol of immigration America celebrates today. She was born in the imagination of abolitionists sculpted in the shadow of the Civil War, meant to commemorate the end of human bondage. But somewhere between the drafts of clay and the final bronze, her blackness was erased, her chains hidden, and her meaning rewritten. That cover-up didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and carefully executed by a nation terrified of what true freedom for black people might mean. The France that designed her had no problem acknowledging slavery's end, but the America that was supposed to receive her could not stand the idea that liberty had a black face. Let's rewind to the 1860s. Frédéric-Auguste Bartholdi, the French sculptor, and Édouard de Laboulaye, the political thinker who inspired the idea, were both abolitionists. Laboulaye believed that after the Union's victory in the Civil War, the United States, a country built on the promise of liberty, should be honored with a monument celebrating the end of slavery. His exact words, recorded in correspondence, spoke of the triumph of liberty over servitude. Bartholdi's early sketches reflected that message clearly. Liberty had African features and was shown breaking chains at her feet. That was not symbolism for European immigrants. It was an explicit reference to freed slaves. But when Bartholdi arrived in America to pitch the project, he was met with a nation in turmoil. Reconstruction was collapsing, racial violence was surging, and white America was actively rewriting its narrative to center reconciliation between North and South, not justice for the formerly enslaved. Politicians were building monuments to Confederate soldiers, not to black freedom. Wealthy donors, many of whom had profited from slavery, wanted no part in funding a statue that celebrated its abolition. So, the pitch had to change. The design was softened. The African features were replaced by European ones. The broken shackles, originally prominent, were minimized and tucked beneath the statue's robe, where few would notice them. Her raised torch was reframed, not as a light of emancipation for freed slaves, but as a beacon for immigrants seeking the American dream. The message of racial liberation became one of national pride. This transformation wasn't just aesthetic, it was ideological. America was desperate to cleanse itself of the shame of slavery without confronting its reality. So the statue that had once embodied freedom for the enslaved became a symbol of freedom for everyone except those who still faced lynch mobs, segregation laws, and systemic exclusion. The ultimate irony was that, when the statue was unveiled in 1886, Black Americans were barred from participating in the celebration. The very people she was meant to honor were not allowed to stand beneath her torch. The press of the time reveals this contradiction vividly. Black newspapers like the Cleveland Gazette condemned the unveiling, writing that the statue was a hollow mockery, so long as America continued to deny basic rights to its black citizens. Meanwhile, white publications celebrated it as proof that the United States had overcome division, conveniently skipping the fact that the division in question was over the ownership of human beings. The cover-up had worked. The new story, liberty welcoming the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses, became the official one, and the real meaning sank beneath a century of patriotic myth-making. Even the poem inscribed on her pedestal, The New Colossus, written by Emma Lazarus, came years later and further redirected the statue's narrative toward immigration. By then, the abolitionist context was almost completely erased. The torch of freedom was no longer for the freed slave, it was for the incoming European immigrant. The light had shifted from south to north, from Africa to Ellis Island, but history leaves fingerprints. The chains at Liberty's feet still remain, if you know where to look. The design sketches in Bartholdi's archives still show the original concept, unmistakably African, unmistakably emancipatory. And even in early photographs, subtle traces of that heritage peek through: the curvature of the face, the proportions of the lips, the un-European balance of features. These details were never entirely erased. They were simply ignored by those who wrote the history books. This was not just a theft of design, it was a theft of identity. By whitewashing liberty, America effectively rewrote the narrative of freedom to exclude the people who had earned it most painfully. It turned a monument of black triumph into a mask of white virtue. And that's the cruel brilliance of the cover-up. The truth didn't vanish. It was buried under layers of propaganda, schoolbook patriotism, and selective amnesia. When we see Lady Liberty today, towering over New York Harbor, we see not the symbol she was meant to be, but the version America could tolerate. A sanitized goddess of freedom, holding her torch high, not for the enslaved who broke their chains, but for the immigrants who came later. And while her copper skin has long since oxidized to green, her original purpose still glows faintly beneath that surface, waiting to be rediscovered. The story of how America changed her face isn't just about one statue. It's a reflection of how nations rewrite themselves to hide their guilt. The erasure of liberty's black origin mirrors the erasure of black achievement across every corner of Western history. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. And as the evidence continues to mount, Lady Liberty's real face, the one they tried to erase, is beginning to emerge again. For more than a century, the story of the Statue of Liberty has been carefully curated to fit a narrative of whitewashed patriotism. But if you peel back the layers, the archives, the sketches, the letters, the early photographs, the truth stares back at you, bold as copper and impossible to deny. The evidence that Lady Liberty was originally designed as a black woman isn't just theoretical or speculative. It's documented, photographed, and literally cast into the metal beneath her robes. The clues were never hidden. They were simply ignored. Let's start with the letters of Édouard de la Boulaye, the French intellectual who conceived the idea of the statue in the first place. In his early writings during the 1860s, he explicitly references the end of American slavery as the inspiration for his proposed monument. He envisioned a statue commemorating the emancipation of the slaves and the victory of liberty over oppression. Those words, preserved in historical archives in France, are not vague. They're clear and pointed. The statue was meant to honor freedom from slavery, not immigration. Bartholdi's first sketches, made shortly after these discussions, depicted a black woman wearing a broken chain, symbolizing liberation. These sketches, still held in the Musée Bartholdi in Colmar, France, show the unmistakable features of African descent: fuller lips, broader nose, and a face not modeled after any Greek or Roman goddess, but something far more real, more human, more honest. Then there's the physical statue itself. Look closely at Liberty's feet. Even today, you can see broken shackles and chains. They're not symbolic decorations. They were part of the original design, meant to represent the literal breaking of bondage. When the statue's message was changed, those chains were too visible to remove, so they were tucked under the robe, out of easy sight, but never completely gone. Few visitors ever notice them. Fewer still know why they're there. And then there's Bartholdi's correspondence. In one letter to his friend and mentor, he described his desire to create a monument that reflected freedom breaking the chains of servitude. Another early version of the statue, originally titled Egypt Carrying the Light to Asia, was meant for the Suez Canal, and the model was explicitly African, wearing traditional North African garments. When that project was rejected, Bartholdi repurposed the concept for America, adjusting the design, but keeping the essence: an African woman, symbolizing light, knowledge, and liberation. Even the very technique used to construct the statue carries traces of its African origin. The face of Liberty was modeled on a real woman, and there's evidence suggesting that woman was black. Bartholdi, like many artists of his era, used real-life models for his sculptures. Among the models he sketched during his time in Egypt and France were women of African descent, one of whom, many historians argue, inspired the final form of the Statue of Liberty's face. The contours, the high cheekbones, the strong, proud gaze, they all match his earlier works depicting African and Nubian women. When the statue was repurposed for America, those features were softened slightly, but the foundation remained. The face we see today still bears traces of her original form. And then came the photographic proof. Early photographs of Bartholdi's clay models, discovered in the archives of the French National Library, show a darker toned version of Liberty, her features more African than European. The photos, taken before the final mold was cast, reveal that her hair texture was once coarser, her expression less classical, and more grounded in real emotion. Later, when the project gained traction among American investors, those features were deliberately altered to appeal to white donors. It was not an artistic evolution, it was a racial correction. But the most telling evidence comes from the timeline itself. The idea for the statue was born in 1865, the exact year slavery was abolished in the United States. Think about that. A French abolitionist proposes a monument to liberty, the same year enslaved Africans in America are freed, and we're told the statue had nothing to do with slavery. The coincidence collapses under scrutiny. Laboulaye himself wrote that the monument would celebrate the Union's moral victory over servitude. How could such a statue not have been intended for the freed people who had endured centuries of servitude? Even the statue's arrival in the U.S. carries a layer of irony. When the pieces were shipped from France to New York in 1885, newspapers described the statue as the gift of liberty to the free people of America. Yet just a few hundred miles away, black citizens were being lynched, denied the right to vote, and forced into peonage. The hypocrisy was so blatant that it sparked outrage among black intellectuals of the time. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, understood what the statue was supposed to represent and what America had done to it. He never spoke of the statue with pride, only with quiet, measured disappointment at how its meaning had been stolen. There's a reason this version of history was buried. To acknowledge that the Statue of Liberty was originally a black woman is to admit that the foundation of American freedom rests on a black face, a face that the country has tried for centuries to erase. It would mean that the greatest symbol of liberty on U.S. soil is African in origin, not European. It would mean that the torch of freedom was first lit by those who had every reason to doubt America's promise, yet believed in the concept of liberty enough to fight for it anyway. The evidence has always been there, in sketches, in letters, in chains beneath her feet. All that's changed is our willingness to see it. When you recognize the African essence that birthed liberty, you don't just change how you see a statue, you change how you see history itself. Because the lie wasn't only about what she looked like, it was about who deserved to be free. They told us she stood for freedom, but they never said whose freedom she was built to honor. The Statue of Liberty, that towering figure of copper and flame, has watched over generations of immigrants arriving on American shores. But before she became a symbol of new beginnings, she was meant to be the closing chapter of an old wound. Her story was not about Ellis Island. It was about emancipation. It was about the moment when the chains fell, and millions of black men and women walked into a country that promised liberty, but practiced oppression. That promise, that contradiction, was what Lady Liberty was built to confront, and what America buried beneath layers of white paint and polished myth. When you strip away the patriotic slogans and the postcard perfection, you find something raw beneath her surface. A different woman, a different truth. Her torch wasn't meant to welcome. It was meant to remind. It was meant to tell a nation, never again will you chain the hands that built your wealth. And yet, in the rush to rewrite history, America took that torch and turned it into a marketing logo for the very system that once burned her people alive. They took a monument of mourning and turned it into an emblem of innocence. The lie became so big, so constant, that generations grew up thinking liberty was born white, when the truth is that liberty in this country has always been born black. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. Every time truth is buried, it rises somewhere new, in an old archive, in a rediscovered sketch, in the questions of a new generation unwilling to accept hand-me-down lies. Scholars, artists, and everyday people have begun piecing the truth back together, a truth that connects Black Americans not just to the struggle for freedom, but to the very symbol of it. When you look again at Lady Liberty and see the broken chains, when you read Labalai's words, when you study Bartholdi's early sketches, the illusion fades. The statue stops being a whitewashed goddess and becomes something greater, a mirror of resistance, forged from African fire and French idealism. Imagine if children grew up learning that story, that the face of America's freedom was modeled after a Black woman, that her design was born from the ashes of slavery, that her torch was meant to honor those who had survived the unspeakable. Imagine the pride that would ignite in classrooms, in communities, in every heart that has ever felt unseen. Imagine how it would change how we talk about freedom, not as a gift given by one race to another, but as a shared inheritance carved out through struggle, courage, and unbreakable will. That is the story they feared, because that story makes Black people central to the very idea of liberty itself. Reclaiming Lady Liberty isn't just about correcting a myth, it's about reclaiming ownership of the narrative, about reminding the world that Black history is not a footnote to America's story. It is America's story. The same hands that built the plantations, built the nation's wealth, the same spirit that survived the Middle Passage, birthed its culture, the same vision that endured chains, gave the world a symbol of hope. Lady Liberty doesn't just belong to immigrants stepping off ships. She belongs to every descendant of those who were told they had no right to exist, yet still demanded freedom anyway. When you stand at the base of that statue and look up, you can almost hear the ghosts whispering through the copper, not the ghosts of European settlers, but of African ancestors who crossed oceans in darkness, who dreamed of a sunrise they'd never see. The chains under her robe still clink in the wind, a quiet reminder of who she was built for. The torch still burns, whether America admits the truth or not. They told us she was their symbol, their gift, their pride. But the truth is, she was ours first. She was the promise that our struggle mattered, that our freedom was sacred, that the world saw our fight and called it noble. They tried to take her face, her meaning, her soul, but they could never erase the spirit that created her. Because you can repaint copper, you can rewrite textbooks, but you cannot kill truth. And the truth is, the Statue of Liberty was born from Black liberation. So the next time you see her standing tall over New York Harbor, don't just see a monument, see a memorial to every ancestor who broke their chains and lit the fire of freedom with their own hands. Because Lady Liberty isn't just holding a torch for the world, she's holding one for us. Ask yourself this: if America had told that story, the real story, how different would this country look today?